Well, I'm thrilled because I think that there's a lot of great ways to pick books. And I think to kind of start the conversation off, um, again, this time of year is frequently about self-improvement. And you were kind enough to share, a list of at least some of the books that you plan to talk about today with me ahead of time. And I thought, so what led you to choose? You've got a couple of books on there, and I'm going to let you do the name dropping and say
Okay. Which one
that
should we
are
start
kind of
with?
around that, like self-improvement
Hmm.
or like really deepening your engagement with the world.
Yeah, I don't set out and say I'm going to do self-improvement reading. Like I never do that. That's not something that I'm like trying to do. I think it's just an orientation that I tend to have is like this is an opportunity for me to learn something and get somewhere. So, I mean, I've always had a very deep interest in psychology, sociology, philosophy. So, the first book, which is a really weird book, that's not weird. It's called Neurosis and Human Growth: The Struggle Towards Self-Realization by Karen Horney. And she's a neo-Freudian. So her books didn't get a lot of attention because they weren't translated into English. I actually discovered this uncharacteristically on YouTube through a psychologist. I don't even know how this came up because it's not something I do. I don't look at books on YouTube. I don't really watch YouTube very much. Um, so for me to find a book like this on YouTube is kind of uncharacteristic. And I had never heard of her. And I thought, well, this is interesting. So I picked up the book, and the book, there's basically one idea in the book that I thought was really compelling. There's a bunch of ideas, but one idea that I really liked was this idea of that we are what she called fraudulent bookkeepers of our own experience, right? So we keep records and thoughts, and we have a really hard time with what she calls a neurotic claim. So this is the big idea in the book to me. The neurotic claim is like you're trying to get somebody to do something. And you may actually be 100% justified, morally, physically, practically justified in demanding this change from this other person, this thing from this other person. And they don't give it and they don't do it. And yet you're stuck demanding that they do it. She calls this a neurotic claim. And I was really affected by this because one of the things that I was really interested in, I picked up another book once upon a time off of the Toronto Reference Library shelf called The Cassandra Complex. And some of us may know Cassandra. I've written about the Cassandra complex elsewhere, but Cassandra was a mortal in Greek times. It's a Greek myth. And she was cursed by Apollo to always see the future, but also for no one to believe her. So she was very angry about this. Like, I know there's soldiers in that horse. Don't let the horse in the city. And nobody believed her. And she was like, I told you, as she had a very difficult time. So the neurotic claim to me is really the Cassandra complex. Understanding what is really the source of your suffering you can externalize it. And it is often somebody else's fault that can be very justified. Um, in the book, The Cassandra Complex, it was written by a psychotherapist, and she was talking a lot about like a lot of these patients that she has are justified in their suffering. You know, they've undergone some difficult things. Your neurotic claim may be justified, but that doesn't change the fact that they're not going to change, right? That they're not going to do the thing that you want them to do. So how are you going to deal with that? Because the only one suffering right now is you. So it was I thought it was a really interesting um an interesting book. And it was very surprising to me that I didn't know about it, even though it was written in the 40s. I didn't know about her. I found that curious.
Yeah, I think we were talking about just another one of your recommendations and just how it related to something that's, you know, the Nobel Prize in economics work that's happening now. I'm like, that is a distant forebear, but like very relevant to that. Um, and I think that we sometimes, it's interesting. So I trained as a librarian, and one of the things that you learn is shelf reading, which is actually so when you're doing like essentially figuring out where you're going to place books in a library, there's discovery that happens when you physically go into the library and look at the stacks, because books that are actually related to one another are physically placed next to each other.
Right. Yeah.
And that does not, it's called a shelf list essentially. So like literally libraries will like take a shelf list and double check, like, is this in the place where it should be on the shelf, right? Because they're trying to promote that discovery, and that's a
Mm-hmm.
lot harder in a digital setting because there isn't like a physical place to go.
Mm-hmm.
You do go all those different places, and so I think part of the challenge of discovery is just like, where do you want to cross ideas?
Mm-hmm.
YouTube is a great place, right? As good a place as any to do.
Where do I run across ideas? Is that what you're
Yeah.
asking?
So where
Um,
do you run across ideas? And then maybe we can segue into the next book.
I run across ideas oftentimes in little tidbits. They're like footnoted level of tidbits in articles or newspaper articles, magazine articles, skeets. I'm not on Twitter anymore. Other places, I was like, that's interesting. And I'll do a little bit, the whole idea of the scent of information and the citation chaining, right? I citation chain. So I'll go to the next one and the next one and the next one, and then I'll find the original. And then the original is always so much more interesting. The reference by somebody else is like, meh, I want to get to the original, and the original is often there's more in here. So that's usually how I find it. I just indulge my little scent and I follow it.
Yeah, smart. Well, shifting gears a little bit. So for the next book, I think I'd love to hear about why you picked it. So this is the one, it's really about the future.
Ah, yes, Imaginable.
Hmm.
Yes,
So
by
what
Jane
made you
McGonigal.
pick that one? Yeah.
Well, I knew her work, of course, from I've read other stuff that she's done, and I think she's still a fellow at the Institute for the Future. So I do a lot of foresight work. So it wasn't crazy for me to find a future book from somebody that I'd already read. Um, this book it's a little different than how I approach looking at the future and foresight. She comes from a gaming background, so she's interested in. I'm not a gamer, except for that one period in university when I was really addicted to Mortal Kombat, and I was really good, and it was really bad, so I stopped playing. I was like, man, fully addicted. Kano was my main person, by the way, and I knew the kill move. Um, but it's been a long time since I've been a gamer, so I haven't been up on gaming, and so it's not really my thing. So it was really uncharacteristic of me to pick up this book. But I read it and I thought, oh, okay, so she's kind of coming into it from a gaming perspective. Gaming is about immersing yourself in a very immersive experience, a simulated world, and so she weaves together information or research on neuroscience and simulation studies to find out what it's like for brains to think about the future, basically, like a place that doesn't exist. How do you manage it? And so she's trying to argue that like gaming is a way for you to kind of like pre-experience the future. And this is something really useful for researchers. For example, if researchers are trying to help with generative projects or foundational projects, and you find people are just like so like narrow, and they're getting very very black and white, and they're very planful, and they've sucked all the beautiful marrow out of imagination about what could be. She gives some tips on how you can kind of immerse people to kind of like disarm those defenses and to get people to think about the future in the way that they may actively game, like enjoy a game or enjoy a science fiction film. Like they're not doing that when they go into meetings because they think this is a meeting, you know. And she gives insights on how, simulation and simulation experiences help you disarm resistance to planning, to thinking about the future. So it is kind of interesting. Not really my bag, but I got some neuroscience out of it and some gaming insights out of it.
I also think about just the fact that, from a, and this is very interesting, I'm a huge science fiction reader. And I find that many technologists, so designers, engineers, are also pretty seriously into science fiction.
It's true. It's true. I'm a hardcore techie and or Trekkie and I always have been. Like OG, you know. So I know Star Trek. I love Star Wars, but I actually prefer, Andor, by the way, which was like the best Star Trek ever. Like or Star Wars ever. I can't even believe it was made by people who never even saw Star Wars. Like it's crazy. So you can like sprinkle a little bit of science fiction into a meeting and you kind of get that same disarming experience, especially when they are like tech forward type people. They tend to recognize it. And then they go, well, wait a minute, this isn't work. And you're like, yes, it is. This is work.
What I find very interesting is that there are science fiction, right, especially like some of the cyberpunk folks who've actually gone in and become contributors as
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Cyberpunk wasn't a manual though.
yeah.
Please, let's not make it real.
I hope not. I really hope not. All right. So I found this. I was looking at this on my shelf. I was gonna actually show it. I'll flip it, but so the next book is really, I think, much more of a call to some of the things that we focus on as researchers.
Hmm.
So I'd love to hear you talk about why the
Are,
next
are
book.
you not going to show the book? You're
I'll
like,
show the book. I'll show the
show the
book
book.
because
There we go. Qualitative
I had it
literacy.
on my shelf and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to show the book. Can everybody
Yeah.
see?
Yeah, it's a great book. This is by Small and Kalerko. And they are a pair of sociologists who are really good methodologists, but also great contributors to the empirical literature. Um, and the reason I put this book on is because it's one of the few truly like academically authored methods texts that is actually super practical as well. So, what they do, especially if you're interested in improving your field noting, for example, or maybe your interview summaries, they give an interview and then they say, okay, this is the basic summary or this is the basic observational field note that the person took of this instance. And they say, yeah, it's okay, but here's what's wrong with it. And then they go back and they do it again. And they go, so we added this thing that we said that you should do. And this is how it's better. And then they go back and they do it again with another thing that they say you should do. And so they give you very, very specific, like explicit demonstrations on how to improve your qualitative skills. And I think what happens a lot of times in UX research in particular, we have a lot of people who do UX research that didn't get trained in this. They didn't get trained in qualitative methods. So they think, oh, well, I have a, psychology degree and I focused on biostats or something, whatever. I'll just do the research as research. Well, it's not. Qualitative research actually has a set of skills, and a lot of them are embedded, right? Like you need to experience these directly. And Small and Kalarko make that experience for you. And so they give you very specific examples. And it's just such a really well done book.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because I find so I work with a lot of master's students who are graduating, becoming qualitative researchers, and they're fine at conducting interviews. They're really, it takes a long time to get good at the analysis piece, and then the
Right.
synthesis piece I think does not happen until you've been doing qualitative research for at least a year.
Oh, at least. At least. Yes, I agree with you. And that's what's so great about this. They kind of demystify that process. Like when you're trying to up level your own skills, you're not entirely sure sometimes what it takes, like what is missing. And they actually make it very clear. Like if you're going to do an interview, here's how you do the interview. If you're going to do analysis of the interview, this is how you do the analysis. If you're going to do the interpretation of that interview, here's how you do that. And those things are all blended together in most like boot camps or even like the tiny qual class that you can take, to, augment your quant. Like it's just, it all blends together. They actually cut it together, cut it out and show you each pace. And I think that's wonderful because most people don't get that training.
No, and they aren't required to get that practice either. So, and so they kind of hit that wall when they finally get a job and have to explain to someone, how did you come to this?
Yeah. And if you can't say, how did you, I'm sorry, but you don't have method. Like, if you can't tell me specifically step 1, step 2, step 3, I had these decisions to make, these trade-offs to consider. I chose this direction. I made this trade-off. You can't tell me that. That means that you don't have method. And that means that you're not actually doing methodologically sound research. Qualitative research has method. A lot of us don't know that because we didn't get trained in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually the other thing that just came to me is like, we often go in with here's what it is that we want to learn. And one thing that kind of rocked my world a little bit when I first read about it was grounded theory and how different that is as a perspective, right? From where you're coming from when you're thinking about doing qualitative
A
research. So
hundred
throwing that
percent.
out there just to say, like, would you like to throw in other
Yeah, yeah.
recommendations?
Well, I mean, when I think about grounded theory, I think about one of my professors in my PhD, Lorna Irwin, who was the director of the Qualitative Research and Resource Center at York University. And she would say, grounded theory does not mean grounded in theory. That's not what it means. And we all were like, oh no, she's got a bone to pick. Oh gosh, I don't know what the difference is. What does she mean? Yeah, grounded theory. I mean, you can read, Denson and Lincoln, you can read all the classics, but I actually think Small and Calarco do a pretty good job. Miles Huberman and Saldana in the qualitative analysis book, great job. And of course, Cresswell's work also fantastic, right? Like it will tell you what this stuff is, right? Grounded theory does not mean grounded in theory. It basically means inductive, basically, more or less.
Yeah. Yeah. So so shifting gears a little bit. So we were talking about right before everyone joined us, the next book, because um it's been something I've been very passionate about since they announced the Nobel Prize. And I
Tell
can
us
talk
about that. Tell us about the Nobel Prize and why this is connected to the
why
book.
it's related. So the Nobel Prize in economics this year was awarded to people who were talking about the difference between countries that had essentially gone through the colonial like experience
Versus those who had
and at
not.
the end of it versus those who hadn't, and why they were underdeveloped when you're looking at like first, second, third world, if you're using those old terms, right? And to me, I thought, well, of course, if you're using extractive policies, you're going to the capital flows are going to go in a one direction and
And
not be
not the
shared.
other.
It's not going to be
Mm.
equitable, and it's not rocket science. Like, I don't understand why they won a Nobel for that. That should be clear. But anyway, this was when I was reading because I haven't read this book, but when I was reading the description of it, I'm like, oh, so that is kind of the forebear of that work.
Yes, it is. I mean, this was published in, I believe, 1949. So this is, I think, Eric Robinson, I think is the author's name. I can't remember if it's Eric Robinson. Regardless, he went on to become the first prime minister of Barbados after he wrote this dissertation for his PhD at Oxford. And the book is called Capitalism and Slavery. Very simple title. And you're like, oh, okay, what does capitalism have to do with slavery? Well, his basic argument was everybody thinks England was different than the United States because they outlawed slavery in the British Empire. Um, well, they're not, he points out, because mercantilism was still part of the English experience and they locked down trade routes, and specifically before they outlawed slavery in the Caribbean. And so in the Caribbean, there were many absentee plantation owners that were great lords in England, and the capital flows went one direction. They were forced to buy product and services from England, and they were forced to send their product, mostly sugar, back up. Also, other things, back up to England. And I was really shocked when I read his scholarship is excellent. It's very good. He gives very good detailed. But basically, you walk around like Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds. There's going to be captains of industry, names on buildings, monuments. And guess what? I mean, to me, I was like, oh, well, they're not slaveholders. No, but they did manage, massive capital extraction out of the Caribbean. And the only reason that this changed is because England took over and began extracting out of India. So then they got the moral high ground and got to say that America, you're so cheap, you have cheap labor, you're slave labor. We don't have that. Well, you used to have it in England and you got everything out of it. So, and now you have it in India where you can take all of their fabrics and all of their whatever. So it was a very well done. And he wasn't even going to publish it. And so it took him years to publish it. And it's a very well written, very straightforward, surprisingly applicable and approachable. So it's worth it. And you're right. I mean, do we really need a Nobel Prize to tell us that this happened? But I'm glad they got it, you know. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Sometimes I think people need to see it, just like all of the connections made for them. But I think, yeah, sometimes
the
it's just a
connections are made. Yes, the connections are made very easily and straightforwardly, and it's pretty hard to deny. Yeah.
yeah. Well, this is a very different book, the next one on the list. Um,
Yes.
so why don't you talk about why you picked it?
The author is Sarah Polley, and some of you may know her as a screenwriter and a director, an Oscar Award winner. You may know her as a child star. She was on The Road to Avonlea when she was a child in Canada, and she was the star, She was also in The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. She was the lead character in that. But this is a memoir, and the memoir is taking root when she had a traumatic brain injury. And she was having difficulty coping with her brain injury. And she went to all sorts of doctors, and they were saying, take it easy, like when you get headaches, go out of the light and do this. And, basically treat yourself with kid gloves. And she wasn't getting any better. And she went to a doctor, a neurologist, who said, run towards the danger. That's what he said to her. And within reason, of course, right? Within reason. But so she ran toward the danger and she got herself through it. And she won the Oscar after this, right? Which is very inspiring. She's also a wonderful writer. And the stories she tells about being a child star may be interesting to people who like that genre because there's a lot in there. Um, and she's very it's not a tell-all, like it's not like, oh, boo-hoo, this happened to me. It's more, it's a thoughtful, grown woman, with her own children and her own life, trying to make sense of everything that's happened to her. And it's very well written. She's very intelligent and gifted, and thoughtful. And so I don't usually read memoirs, honestly. I don't. And I'm kind of surprised I put this one on the list, but I found it inspiring.
Yeah, and I think I heard an interview with her on CBC a few months, like right when she had first published the book.
Hmm.
And I found it very interesting just because and I forget who she's married to, but she's married to a very famous actor as well.
Who's she married to? I don't know who she's married to. And now we're gonna have to Google this, aren't we? What?
Yeah, we're gonna have to Google it. I don't
Yeah.
remember his name
Somebody
is.
put it in the chat.
Yeah, somebody will have to look it up and put it in the chat.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting because, you know, I think she's very grounded in a way that we don't expect people who are celebrities to be. And she's made a choice not to engage with the world as a celebrity, but as like
Just an average person.
an average person.
Yep.
And so I think that's the reason why the memoir is so interesting, because it's like your sister.
Yeah, she's just a person. I can imagine, like, well, I mean, it also helps the fact that I lived in Toronto for a long time and she's a like OG Toronto gadfly. I can imagine her house. I know what it looks like, kind of, I know, like, I could imagine walking into her on the street, with her kids on the way to the store or whatever. So yeah, she just seems like David Sandomirsky. What is he in? Yeah. Uh,
I don't know. But I could have, I don't know what it is that he does, but I feel like he's
related in some way. The book is worth reading because it gives you like somebody who's been through some stuff, making sense of that stuff artfully and with grace. And it's inspiring, I think.
That's what it is. He's a professor. That's why I know him.
There you go.
So
Yeah.
interesting to me, maybe not to everybody else.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, she's also in a really great deep cut movie, by the way, called Go from the
oh,
90s.
yeah.
It's surprisingly good. It still holds up. I watched it just the other day and I was like, you know what? That's a pretty good film. You should watch it.
I
Go.
will have to go watch that. That was a
Yeah.
good one. So interestingly enough, um, I'm very interested in the next book because I think I have not read it yet.
Hmm.
But I'm very curious because I am at this point where I'm like, I need more positivity in my life and I need to do it in an intentional way. So I'd
Hmm.
love to hear about why you picked up this book and yeah.
You know, it's funny. My husband and I both read on Kindle a lot, and I did not know this, but literally for years, my library books were appearing on his Kindle. And I was a little taken aback by that. I can't, first of all, I can't believe I didn't know that. I mean, I worked at Amazon. Um, and secondly, I was like surprised at how wild that was that he never said anything all these years. Anyway, now I'm taking advantage of it. It's a feature, not a bug. So I said, you know, there's a book that just arrived on my Kindle list that you should read. And he's like, really? And I almost never recommend books to him because he's like reading books about woodworking and, like stuff like that. I don't, he's read detective novels, which I literally haven't read in like 20 years. But I was like, you should read this one. And he's like, why? Yeah, I don't like your books. I was like, well, I'll give it a try. And he took it back and he agreed. And the reason I think he agreed is because I tend to read books that are like really like self-improving books, right? And he finds them tiresome. They're always trying to tell you about how to be more mindful and, like make more meaning in life and this kind of stuff. And he can't be bothered like being told to do that kind of thing. This book had a twist on that, that you need meaning, of course. Everything needs to, you need to have some sort of core meaning in your life, whether it's your faith or your vocation or something, right? Like you need meaning. But you also need, this argument goes, to have things that are fun and creative and no purpose. I won't go as far as saying hedonistic, but you need things that are, inviting your attention. And for me, it was really interesting because I tend to do the kind of like hard meaning type things. Like I'm like, okay, I'm gonna read these big ideas and I'm gonna try to put them into practice and da, da, da. And it does get exhausting after a while, right? You can't be all wisdom all the time. So the idea of the book is just like basically be softly curious about anything. And guess what? You're not bored. You can be softly curious about just, the tree outside. You can be softly curious about like the grind on your coffee. You can, anything can be interesting. And you can spend time with it and you can get fulfillment from this. And it gives you kind of like a richness. And I think the reason this is on the list is because I mean, you guys tell me, but I think we have a crisis these days. I think a lot of people are exhausted. Um, they're bored, but also tired, and they're having a hard time kind of like discovering things anymore. It's just like this endless stream. I used to get this when I got the Economist subscription, the physical magazine, and it would come every week. It would be like it's so dense every week. And I was like, I barely got through it last week. Oh God. Eventually I had to stop the subscription because I just couldn't keep up. That's what life feels like, even if it's like good things, like, oh, I'm going to read the latest thing on this, or I'm going to read this teardown of that, or blah, blah, blah. You don't have to do that. You can just adopt the soft fascination with your life as it is. And it can be very fulfilling. Even if you're like single and you live alone and you don't even have pets, and sometimes you feel lonely, you can have interest in your life. Um, all of those things. I thought that was just worthwhile because I think we're all kind of empty, you know?
It's interesting that you say that because there's been a lot of talk recently about the epidemic of loneliness in the
Yes.
United States, right? And just people feeling disconnected from one another. And, I think when I was in grad school, one of the faculty members was really focusing on just because this was really before we had social media, um, just how the internet was reinforcing the bad habit of people holding up at home and thinking that they're engaging with the world by just using their computers.
Right. Right. It feels like now I'm not gonna go as far as, like, the Sherry Turkle digital duelist kind of bah humbug kids you day these days. I think virtual relationships still matter. Online experiences still matter, right? Like, you do have real relationships in the virtual world, that is true, and so I don't wanna denigrate that at all, but there's a fine line between relationships and just, like, doom scrolling, you know? And doom scrolling gets the best of all of us, including me, so just waking up to interest, oh, this is interesting. That is interesting. There's so many things that are interesting, and I didn't even have to like make a big deal out of it. It's a kind of inspiring book. And so my husband actually told me he liked it, which I thought was surprising. And I figured that's a big win.
That is a big win. And it's really interesting. I was watching Sherry Turkle did an interview with someone about some of her research that she's been doing recently. So go look on YouTube for that because I found it fascinating. That is something that I actually had to pause a couple of times because it was a very rich conversation. But
Really. So what was her more recent stuff?
she's been doing a lot of work actually around AI and like relationships between like is it good essentially that people are having emotional attachments to LLMs?
Hmm. She did get a little bah humbuggy in her last work, so I was kind of, like, turned off by I was like, "Come on." Like, it just felt like she didn't really understand that virtual relationships are real relationships.
I think she might have come around a little bit.
Interesting, okay, I'll take another run at it. Perhaps it was one of those books I throw down with great force.
Yes. And I think she's just spending more time with it. I still think that she doesn't love it, right? Because she's a people person, right?
Mhm. Yep, yep.
And I think
Gotcha.
that that matters. That
Mhm.
orientation matters, yeah.
Yeah, I think you might be right. Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah. But okay, so the last book on the list,
Yes.
but you are welcome to add more. I know that a lot of us, especially in the US, have just gone through this period, but it's not just the US, right? In the past week, we've seen Georgia and South Korea and
Mhm.
France all at the same point of inflection, right?
Mhm.
Germany too, right? And
Germany too. Mhm.
um
Yeah.
just curious about how all that context supports or contributes to your pick, your next pick.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, that's kind of why that pick is even there. The book is called The Monarchy of Fear by Martha Nussbaum, and she's a philosopher. And the it's kind of interesting. I was just rereading some of the like reviews on Goodreads and on Amazon about it, and I was like laughing to myself because the negative reviews are like she talks too much about psychology. The Greek philosophy stuff is good, but why is she talking about psychology? And I was like, come on, you guys. You missed her entire point. Her entire point was that, fear and our fear can give way to anger. And, fear is what can animate anger and animate tribalism in a way that's really, really dangerous. And, we need to approach it. And she does like a great job, I think, of telling you like kind of where this comes philosophically, how these things are related, why fear and anger are basically the same thing in a lot of ways. And then, of course, how it underpins the ability of, countries to navigate change. So, if you're a thinking person, you'll see fear everywhere in political states, right? You'll see it in totalitarianism. This is why, lessons for totalitarianism is to do not obey in advance. The reason people obey in advance is because they're afraid. So ask yourself, how afraid are you? right? About anything, right? Like, what are you not doing or not saying? And she just lays that bare in a very approachable way, and she talks about it psychologically as well. So, the reply guys with this isn't enough Greek philosophy. Oh, whatever, your opinion, that's okay. Um, I personally, I've liked reading her work in the past, so I found this to be quite useful in understanding the current state of affairs in a lot of places. I get these little moments, like these almost tiny little moments where I can transcend the deeply horrifically offensive, if not outright genocidal statements that other people make. I get very close to seeing past that, almost on the other side of it. Not quite. Um, I mean, and it's almost impossible to see through somebody who wants to exterminate you. It's almost impossible, right? But you can try. And then you realize, oh, okay. This is another lesson. I should probably put that on lessons, 20 lessons for authoritarianism or totalitarianism, whatever it is, Snyder's book. Um, is try to come up with your own concepts. I had a conversation with somebody who was the last person I expected. I've met this person several times at lots of different design and UX meetups, and this person um, had what I consider to be kind of offensive things to say. I made a point the next time I saw this person to talk with them again directly. And I realized something very interesting. This person was picking up concepts that they had heard somewhere, and they did not interrogate the concept. They just said, "Oh, this looks like I could use it to explain something that's scaring me or frustrating me. And I'll just use it." And then they put it out there, and it's like the worst possible thing you could say to me, right? And I realized that this person does not interrogate these concepts at all, right? Hasn't even thought through them. They're just like, something freaks me out. So I'm going to, oh, here's a ready made puzzle piece that's just been given to me. And I'm just going to stick it into my vocabulary and it's going to explain everything to me. And then somebody who hears it says, that is a truly offensive, horrible thing that you just said. And I am not going to talk to you anymore, or I'm going to be like angry with you because of it. Justified? Sure. But it doesn't get to the point where, why is this person even saying this ridiculous concept that doesn't even mean anything, you know? Uh, After the second conversation, I got kind of to the other side of it, kind of to the other side of it with this person. And I thought that was like, okay, this doesn't mean no accountability. This doesn't mean, don't be, oh, let it go. Who cares? Blah, blah. No, it doesn't mean cancel culture is bad. Like, no, it doesn't mean any of those things. It just means understanding. And she makes a point of doing that, like understanding everybody's fear. It's useful. If you can get to the other side of it slightly, I think it's worth it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, it just reminds you have to interrogate like how it is that you're engaging with all the ideas that you're engaging with. I think sometimes people think if you read a book, you agree with it automatically.
That's right. I
And
think that's true.
um and I run into that a lot because I'll say, "Oh, I read this book," and people will be surprised because
Why are you reading them? Yeah. I think you're right. I think you're right. And I mean, you have to own that in yourself too. You're recoiling from a genre of person or a genre of ideas um is fearful, right? Like I know that it's fear on my part. Like I'm worried, I'm scared. And the recoiling I have is I feel powerless. I feel you know, worried about the future. I feel protective of people who are even, more vulnerable than me. I feel all those things. And so for me to approach this worst possible idea seems like that's craziest thing to do, right? It's a terrible thing. No, it's not actually. You go into it and you're like, oh, this is an empty, vacuous concept. But they have something in here that is worth paying attention to. And that is our overall, all of us feel powerless. All of us are feeling disconnected. Unfortunately, the puzzle pieces that many people are picking up and sticking into their missing pieces are they're horrible, they're awful, right? And they haven't thought them through. They haven't really thought them through. They haven't interrogated themselves. They haven't taken ownership. That doesn't mean don't hold people accountable. Absolutely hold people accountable, but try to understand them a little bit.
yeah. Yeah, understand the perspective, especially. Yes, yes, yes. So I think, I'm going to invite people to continue to drop in thoughts, feedback, questions, because we can take a couple of questions. Um, I do think that a couple things as we wrap. Um, is there a book that doesn't appear on the list that you'd like to speak to
Oh my gosh, there's
that
so
came up
many.
as we were speaking? I know.
There are so okay, honestly. Okay, so will you indulge me while I just look at my books for a second?
Yeah.
Because I mean, there's just so many uh that I can't get. It was very hard for me to pick books that actually were, fit. Okay, so for example, Roar by Dr. Stacy Sims.
Mhm.
She's an exercise physiologist, and she talks about women's books or women's bodies as like accepted from medical research. And that's why we don't know optimum performance. And we've been telling women, as a matter of fact, this individual that I was just talking about that had these puzzle pieces that was missing and was using like stupid words like woke. Um, uh, I brought up something I found in this book about women under feeding themselves because they've been told they have to be smaller, especially elite athletes. And he said, this is the minute it broke. I think that's happening to my niece. And I was like, tell me more about this. His niece is very, you know, elite cross country runner at the high school level. And yet she's suffering from this ongoing issue where she's just not, and it's nutrition. She's just not getting enough nutrition because she's been told she has to be smaller and lighter and blah, blah, blah. So Stacey Sims's book Roar is really enlightening and it's infuriating to read because you realize all the bad advice that you've been given as a woman. That's a really good one. I mean, I could just go on of all the ones that I've been reading, but and Love's Executioner. I read that just recently, and that is it took forever on the holds list. Somebody put the Libby app in the chat window. What happens with the Libby app is that you put things on hold and then it takes like 6 months. And you're like, what is this? I don't know. And you just download it. Anyway, uh it is a really touching story, set of stories by a psychotherapist and the kind of challenges that his patients have had. And it's very human, very heartening. I liked that a lot. That was another one. But what about you, Leah? You had some
I
that you
did, and actually related to that one that you just mentioned, real self-care.
real self-care.
Yes, which again, I ran into this person. I was listening to a podcast, and she is a psychiatrist, actually.
Hmm.
But the premise of this book is that the self-care industry, which is really performative in nature, which is around like, hey, pamper yourself and go take baths and blah blah
Right.
blah,
Right.
is not the real
Hey,
problem.
that's the like rich white lady version of self-care, which is like not really self-care.
And her version, she is herself not a rich white lady, um, but informed by both her work and personal experience. So she was in a cult, actually. I know. Yes. Very interestingly. Yes. But the shift in perspective really came when she really was working with women of color specifically whose lives were out of control. And so it's like you have to work so much in order to make a living. And I myself had this experience once where I have a kid that has some chronic health issues. And one of the doctors was like, well, you should do some self-care. And I was like, I don't need self-care. I need my kid to go to school every day. And it's such a problem because we prescribe like, go take a bath. But I'm like, really, the problem is I don't have time to take
Structural.
a bath. I need to feed my
Hmm.
kids. Or,
Right.
and so really it's about how do we change systems in order to promote substantive self-care.
Yeah. Real self-care.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. Jess Colerico, actually, who co-authored the qualitatives, she has a book called, I think it's called Holding It Together. And I haven't read it yet, but it is about like in the American context, the lack of the social safety net and what
Mm,
happens in people's lives, particularly women's lives, where the safety net falls, right? So this is what you're talking about. You have a kid that has, you know, can't go to regular school or maybe has, special needs for outside regular needs. And so it takes time and energy and you're holding it together, right? How do you do that? Like there's no social safety net for you. There's nobody who's going to be able to help you. It's all on you, right?
yeah, yeah. And I will leave one last one. It's a business book, but it totally changed my life. And it's
Oh,
so weird. But it's called The Five Dysfunctions of a Team.
oh, I love that one. That's a good one. Yes. Everybody should read that
And
one.
everybody should read it. And I think it's because partially it just like it will make you feel seen as an employee because you will see all the things that go wrong in organizations.
Absolutely. That's a good one. I endorse that one too.
Yeah.
I want to interrupt really quickly. We have a question in the chat from Greg. He has a really excellent question. He says, for those of us who are not trained qual researchers, but fooled enough of people to somehow make UXR a career, I resonate with that. How would you advise we shore up our qual research gaps?
That's a great question. Reading some of the stuff that you're going to get from an academic qual research class, qualitative literacy is a great place to start. Also, getting Cresswell's book, Mixed Methods. I mean, I'm advising his book over mine. Mine's the light version. His is the more detailed version. It'll give you that. Yes, there you go. I mean, and yeah, oh, look at you. Yeah, the 4 stars. I talk about some of those issues right there, like the underpinning, right? But you go to Small and Calarco and they'll give you the very, very step by step. And also Miles and Hubert and Saldana's book, Qualitative Data Analysis. And get some software, get some qualitative data analysis software. I'm not talking about Dovetail or whatever. I'm talking about Max QDA, In Vivo, Atlas TI. These are the ones that are designed specifically for qualitative data analysis. Try playing with those and you'll see the difference. They have AI in them as well.
Atlas TI, I have to like double tap on just because that's what we use at U of M. And it really helps because it helps you, I think, both understand like data structure
Absolutely. Completely. I
and
agree.
just kind of how ideas relate to one another by just visualizing things and thinking about how to plan your note taking. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's very helpful. I mean, thinking in systems quantitatively is one thing, and then thinking in systems qualitatively is slightly different. So using software to help you do that is really worth exploring. Just get a data set. They have fake ones built in, right? You can play with those. Max QDA has a whole bunch on life satisfaction, I think is their fake one. And like you can play with it and do all sorts of crazy things.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
It's been my
And
pleasure to talk about all these books.